Okay, everybody, so here is a really quick tutorial, and these, like the fabric I'm using is not going to be perfect. I was just trying to get the tutorial down for this is a trumpet mask bell cover, because I have a trumpet here. Once I go up to school, I'll get the measurements for a horn, but I'm going to end up using basically an 8 to 9 inch circle of fabric. So I've got a square of fabric that I cut. And then so it's two pieces, and I put them right side together. You don't have to start with that step, but to me, you know, the faster you can get things done, the better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this in half, and then fold it in half again. So I end up with roughly a square. And I would say as long as your edges are pretty close, then you're going to be fine. And I actually took a small dinner plate, and I'm just going to place the fabric to where the corners hit the circle, like so. And then I'm going to trim. I'm going to use my rotary cutter to trim off the excess of that. And again, it's not going to make a perfect circle, but because you're going to use so little elastic, it's going to create a pretty tight binding. So again, I'm just cutting around the plate, using that plate kind of as a stencil. And I would recommend a rotary cutter if you have one, because it's just going to make your life easier. But you could, of course, draw on the fabric, you know, trace the pattern of the circle. And so what you're going to end up, once you cut off the corners, is roughly, and it's going to be a little ovular, but you can see you've got your circle. So what I'm going to do next, and I'm not going to videotape this part because, number one, it'll be loud. Number two, I don't think you need to see this. I'm going to stitch with the right sides together all the way around the circle at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to leave, and I'm going to use this selvage edge here, this white line in the pattern. I'm going to leave about 1 inch of that open so that you can turn it inside out. So what you'll see next is after I've done that first sewing step. Okay, so I have my fabric loaded, and again, you know, it's going to be, especially for this first couple of times as I'm figuring out the best way to do it, it's going to be kind of rough. But I'm going to go in about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, which is going to be kind of right along the presser foot. And I'm just going to stitch around this in a circle, leaving about 1 inch so that I can turn it right side up. Okay, so I just finished sewing around the first round of the fabric, and so you can see here there's like a little inch wide pocket, and so what I'm going to right side out, okay, so that I've got my fabric with the pattern side, although depending on what you're trying to make, you might not need to worry about that. You know, it just depends on whether you want a pattern or a solid color. If your fabric doesn't have a right side, it doesn't matter, but you are going to want to turn that out because that's what's going to allow you to create the elastic pocket. Okay? You might want to leave a little more than 1 inch. This is taking a little longer than my first one to turn out, but basically once you've got it, you're going to end up with a circle that's almost finished all the way around. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to press this flat so that when I go to add the stitching for the elastic, it's evenly stitched around the entire mask. Once you've pressed those seams flat, you're going to want to do the same with that opening that you left, just to make sure that it lines up so that you can either hand stitch or machine stitch right over it, but just so it at least has kind of a finished edge. Again, it does not have to be perfect. Okay, so we pressed it flat. Now we have a pattern on both sides. This was not intentional, but on both the prototype and this one that I'm making, I left a little bit of that white selvage edge that's on the edge of most pattern fabrics. But that's going to help me remember where the top is. So I'm going to do a full circle. You don't have to leave any gap. And I'm going to stitch this time at half seam allowance. So the first time I did 1/4. So I'm going to do half seam. I'm going to go all the way around the circle, and that's going to complete the sleeve between the first seam we made and the new seam for the elastic to go into. So I've got my presser foot set up to be at half seam allowance, or excuse me, half inch seam allowance. Depending on the thickness of your elastic, you might be able to get away with smaller, but this prototype pattern seemed to work really well. I've got 1/4 inch wide elastic, and it seemed to work fairly well in the prototype. Okay, so I've done a full circle all the way around at that half inch seam. Yes, I'm using Pokemon fabric. It's extra fabric that I didn't think I'd have another project for, and so just use that. So got the full circle with the inside seam, which is basically going to hold the elastic in place, and the outside seam, which is keeping the fabric together. And I still have that open inch or so from where I turn the fabric out, and that's where I'm going to thread the elastic. Okay, so I'm using 1/4 inch woven elastic, and actually I already had this cut to 7 inches because that's what's recommended for ear loops on masks. So for the larger instruments, mellophone, trombone, euphonium, baritone, tuba, sousaphone, you'll want longer elastic. But for trumpet, the 7 inch strips seem to work just fine. So I'm going to put a safety pin on one end, and then at the opening where I turn the fabric inside out, I'm just going to pin the opposite end that I'm not threading into the fabric so it stays put. Hopefully you can see this. I'm going to pin that right there, go through the fabric and elastic a couple times so it doesn't move on me. And then the end that has the safety pin, I'm just going to thread through that sleeve that I just made. Safety pin works really well just to rethread through the sleeve. I'm going to switch to time lapse because you don't want to watch me do this in regular time. Okay, so I finished threading it through. You can see that gathered up pretty nicely. I'm going to remove the straight pin that I was holding the elastic in place with, and I'm actually going to take both ends of the elastic, and you can do this a couple different ways. It's really up to just your preference. I like to machine stitch back over this just because it's going to hold a little bit better. So I'm going to put those two ends together and just machine stitch over it. And depending on your elastic and how tightly it's stretched, you might want to do a zigzag stitch. I'm just going to do a running straight stitch and back stitch it a couple times. Okay. And it's okay if it's a little messy, like those didn't quite line up. I've got some stray strings, but honestly it's going to end up inside the cover, so it doesn't really matter anyway. And then you're just going to stretch that out so that the fabric is more evenly distributed, and it kind of creates, it's basically a mini shower cap, right? Depending on how you feel about it, I'm going to go ahead, this is where that open seam was, where I threaded it. I'm going to go ahead and stitch over that just because I don't want to run the risk of it opening up or popping or anything like that. Plus it's just a nicer finish. Real quick, and if these were, I'm sure that when we start making our practice and performance base, we're going to try to make 2 sets. Have a couple of different ideas there. We're talking about color coding per section, just to keep the question of whose is whose. And then we're going to try to find a lighter solid color so that the kids can either write their name or maybe their coordinate number on the end so that we can see from the press box exactly who they are. But there you have it. So there's your finished product. And if you take your trumpet, it's going to open up over the bell and should fit pretty snugly all the way around. Might need to adjust it just a little bit, but there's the idea. So happy, I never thought I would say this, happy bell mask covering making, everybody. Good luck.